it was always amusing. So technology, and as my panelists get themselves mic'd up, I remember my grandmother, as I was growing up, she said, book sense without street sense is nonsense. So I wonder what she can say about artificial intelligence in that regard. But I do see one tremendous advantage. Now I often get into trouble with my wife when she calls me and tells me to do something. And when Gowon and those were talking about now voice cloning, etc., next time I forget, I'm going to say I didn't trust it because I didn't know if it was you. And so when I did the callback procedure and you answered the phone when you never do, I didn't trust it again. So it does have its pluses and minuses in that regard. Have you been having a good day? So, you know, it's interesting when we think about the theme, masterclass and growth and innovation. Sometimes, certainly the word innovation is almost a cliche these days. But we have to get down to the nuts and bolts, and we started the day understanding how the policymakers think. Moving into, well, what is the infrastructural changes? How do we manage talent, et cetera? And then moved into where we see things going in the future with artificial intelligence. And as they were speaking, I remember, you know, you don't go to any conference nowadays where they don't talk about artificial intelligence. And there was a British chap who was trying to explain it to a room of, we would hope, intelligent people. And I think he defined it and at least brought it clear to me. He said AI, generative AI, and all this quantum computing, et cetera, he says is hallucinations. He just says some of the hallucinations a little closer to reality than the others. And when Kevin mentioned, you know, if you give the input bias of always showing sunsets and you ask the color of the sky, it's going to say orange. So I think it's important for us to know that, and the question was asked, whether we see the future. The reality is, I don't think systems are ever going to be able to replace humans. They're not going to be able to think independently. They are going to be able to do a tremendous amount of computing. It's going to be able to sift through a tremendous amount of information. But sometimes things are just not logical. How many times have a person's been to a conference where they said, let ChatGPT write an apology letter to your spouse or your loved one, and they see, you know, the information that comes up on the board? And, you know, I smile because there's cultural differences, right? When you're in North America, Europe, they may say, yeah, that's a very well-written piece. And I always say, well, that don't work in the Caribbean, because the first thing your spouse can say, who the hell write that? Because that don't sound nothing, because that's proper English. And so I can ask the formal panel when I get off the stage, is this new voice sort of recognition and being able to clone picking up the bad Bahamian accents? Because if it's not doing that, we're still going to be okay. So they ask me, they don't pay me to be a clown or to be the comedian. So they're trying to do all of the actual miking up and as they come. So as I move, today, I asked them where did they find the picture of me that is in the actual booklet, because I have hair. And, you know, I think they said, based on those who will be sitting on the panel with me today, all of them have a lovely head of hair. And they looked at some of the panels before. John, they didn't look at your panel yet. And then they could have put my actual hair. So I could say that about John. He's my friend. But the next session is speaking about reimagining taxation and crafting effective policies. It's quite an interesting one when we think about the future and tax. It was Benjamin Franklin, when speaking about the Constitution and other things, said, in this world, nothing can be certain except death and taxes. Quite interesting that he picked those two elements. I think all of us appreciate that if we came into this world, we're eventually going to go out. But he used taxes as being one that is certain. And the reality is, when we think about taxation, it often is one that frightens persons, because I don't know anyone who likes paying taxes. But the reality is it's a necessity, because we have all of the elements that says, how do we ensure that we are funding the initiatives necessary to carry forward with national development? So today I have 3 panelists, and you'll see them as they walk onto the stage. And we won't read the bios because they're on the app and they're available to you. But there was one common theme that I saw through all of them. Can anyone guess what it was? Everyone, for some reason, referenced 20 years, having been in the profession for 20 or more than 20 years, except Tomás. And I think he was trying to separate himself from everyone else and saying he was much younger than us all, that he wasn't that old. But I only could surmise that they started working from they were 7 or 8, because they didn't seem to be that old. So I thought I was the oldest one on the panel. I didn't try to find out whether that was indeed the case. So, welcome, guys. There you go. So with us today, we have Patricia at my far left, who many of us in the room will have known in her role previously or former life. So she on the other side now, you on the good side, not the dark side, in that one. We have Olivia, who is one of those that shared the 20-year experience, but looking at base erosion, profit sharing, and cross-border elements in that regard. And then Tomás, who I wasn't sure if he was one of the models or one of the tax advisors, because he certainly was decked out this afternoon. But ladies and gent, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
We started the process about this element of taxation. And you can tell I don't trust AI. I printed my things on paper. So if the systems fail, old, trusted, reliable pieces of paper. Now, my eyesight going bad, so it may not help me anyhow. But if we start the conversation off, and as I said, I made reference to Benjamin Franklin, who said there's only 2 certainties, and that was death and taxes. Taxes always has a negative connotation. So I want to start the conversation this afternoon to really ask the question, what is taxation? Is it merely or solely a transfer of wealth from the private sector to the public sector? Or is it more than that? And when we start talking or think about taxes, we should be a bit broader, because it actually can be an instrument that is used for competition and national development. And I'll start with you, Patricia.
All right, thanks. You hearing me?
They're coming through.
All right, thanks, Gowon. So yes, taxation can have a negative connotation, and it can come across as if it's really just an extraction of wealth from the private sector to the public sector. But it can be actually a very important tool in a government's macroeconomic policy in terms of signaling those industries or those types of activities that the country may want to encourage. So, for example, in the context of the Bahamas, where financial services is a critical area, the tax structure can encourage persons to enter that space and to and certain activities as well. So, for example, some jurisdictions have special rates for capital gains to in terms of signaling that's in terms of encouraging investment. And so the rates that are used, the incentives, where you have exemptions, those can be used to signal the industries, the activities that are being encouraged, and also to compete, because of course we're in a global environment, and there are always opportunities that exist for countries to be able to compete with other countries, and certainly for the Bahamas there are a number of opportunities now. The Attorney General spoke earlier today in terms of some of the opportunities that exist with changes in the legislation in the UK, for example. And so, the taxation structure can be used, the system, the rates can be used to encourage that, as well as to discourage certain things. And so we know, for example, we've heard of like sin taxes So, you know, like excise taxes for tobacco or sugar taxes to indicate the activities that the government wants to discourage. And as well, taxation is used, it's a source of revenue for the government, and so it's an opportunity for the government to be able to fund social programs, education, healthcare, you know, the type of activities that are infrastructural development. And so it's not necessarily negative, it's the nature of the system, I think, that, that develops. And so the government can use, they can signal through the tax system the areas that are being encouraged and exploit opportunities that exist in the environment in which we are. And so I think ultimately once the system is fair and in terms of the distribution of the burden, as well as in terms of the, you know, the type of incentives that exist and the rate of taxes and you know, just being sensitive to the environment as well as to, you know, and as well, of course, public confidence in the use of the funds that are being collected is an important system, as well as the nature of the tax authority as well, and how the confidence in the knowledge and as well as the fairness and just system that is equitable, the rules being fair and administrable, so that, you know, the government is able to, and as well as the taxpayer and their advisors are able to plan accurately, because so the rules need to be clear and you know, ultimately, so it's not, and so I think ultimately it's not necessarily a negative thing, and so that's
and you mentioned from the public sector, so either Olivia or Tomás, when you think on the private sector side and you see the word taxation, and we know however we phrase it, we are our brother's keeper. So there's a mechanism that is necessary to say, how do I take funds from the productive side of society, if you will, and put it into what is the social side of society that says it needs things. So from a business perspective and the commercial side, you know, can taxation be seen as more than just a transfer of wealth to the government? And can it be seen as a tool in the wider space in which you operate? And, you know, Patricia spoke about some of the elements, maybe environmental, ESG we know is big, but when we think about a tax system, the positive sides that it can be in terms of its own national development.
Yeah, I mean, I echo everything sort of Patricia said. You know, typically there's the private to public sector discussion and how you use those funds, either to redistribute wealth to the more vulnerable or to enhance national development, as you're pointing out, the infrastructure, the health, education, etc. But, you know, there's a third pillar to it, which is critical, which is how do we use it as a mechanism to provide a stable business environment which will allow us to be globally competitive, right? And so that's one of the key roles that the tax can play as a tool to enhance business activity. And it's interesting because we're at a bit of a crossroads in the Bahamas and in a number of other sort of jurisdictions, because I mean, the way we've done business in the last 30 years isn't going to be the same in the next 30, right? And so we really need to take a step back and think about, you know, what's our strategic vision as a country when it comes to tax, right? And we need to make sure that we let the world know what that vision is and what the end game is, because if we don't, you end up in a number of situations where you've provided uncertainty to take sort of Patricia's example, to your sort of international investors, or, you know, be it in the tourism sector or the financial services industry, your international players want certainty. And obviously we all know that over the last couple of years there's been some nervousness around certain areas, like, you know, the business license piece. We repealed the preferential regime. We then sort of replace or remove the export turnover carve-out, but then we cap the IBC fees, and all of that creates a bit of uncertainty in the international community. If you add to that now sort of the stamp duty issues that come with that, and also the VAT sort of discussions happening at the moment in the context of a number of different matters, including financial services, that leaves international investors nervous. And so we should really be using tax as a tool to provide that stable business environment. But to do that, we need that strategy, we need the vision, and we need to let the world know what that strategy and vision are. And that's where sort of the AIBT and the BFSB play a very important role in working with government to help implement that strategy on a day-to-day basis, working shoulder to shoulder with the private sector. And so I think the word of order right now is we need to make sure we're building trust. And there are some fantastic opportunities around the corner on Pillar 2, which I know we're going to be talking about in a bit, which we can leverage on.
So, I mean, leveraging that, I think we've seen that tax is broader than what all of us see. And I remember, certainly coming from the Bahamas, my first introduction to taxation, it was someone stealing from me. So we certainly now know it to be a bit more. But leveraging on what you just started with, Tomás, in terms of how it can be used for business stability, competition, national strategy. What are some of the factors that need to go into the decision on tax structure? Because we talk a lot, sometimes the sources of the income may be different. Sometimes the actual nature of industry, et cetera. So what are those factors that we should be considering? And I'll be coming to you, Olivia and Patricia, with the same element.
I mean, the starting point has to be the strategy, right? What's the vision? It needs to align with the fiscal strategy of the country, right? So that always needs to be the starting point. Everything else is sort of a bit driven by the policies around that. So for instance, we have a very regressive tax system in the Bahamas because it's very consumption-based and sales-based, et cetera. And so typically, it doesn't favor the less vulnerable, right? And so how do we strike a balance between protecting and redistributing to the most vulnerable, whilst at the same time ensuring that we are attractive for the super rich that end up creating the ecosystem that we have for the law firms and the accountants and the trust and corporate service providers and the wealth managers, et cetera. And so it's a lot of times it's striking that balance. And when you're looking to find the policy decisions to strike that balance, you'd look at a number of different things, a few of them which Patricia touched on, right? Do you want an equitable tax system, which is proportionate, right? Which doesn't provide discrimination? Is it a fair sort of tax system? Is it a simple tax system? Complexity is good, because it gives government a lot of options in terms of, we can sort of take from here, put here, et cetera. From a fiscal strategy perspective, complexity is great. From a taxpayer standpoint, we want simple tax regimes. And that's not always easy to have. One would say that the Bahamian tax regime is relatively simple, but not always easy to understand and comes with its issues. We don't have consolidated legislation, we don't have guidance notes which are up to date, etc. And so how do you find that sort of balance? And a key part of it as well is the sort of the social and political acceptance of a regime, right? You need public acceptance of whatever you're going to be implementing. And so once you've sort of set the policy strategy, that's when you can then go down to the factors around, so what do I now need to do in practice to build this tax administration, right?
Olivia, some of those elements, so particularly in your experience, when we talk about base erosion and profit shifting elements, I guess it's the nature of the revenues that are in the particular society. There's the elements of compliance, in terms of how easy is it to implement and get high tax compliance rates. But what are some of the other factors you would see in the tax sort of decisions before getting to where we are today, because we'll get to that. But what are some of those decisions to say when a country is looking at its tax structure that lead into it? And I think Tomás gave a good intro into that. Any other elements to do so?
Yeah, there are all kinds of decisions though. Can you hear me all right? Yeah. There are all kinds of decisions that go into deciding what your tax policy is. There's social policy, there's strategy, and all of those aspects as well. But what we find ourselves in right now in the Bahamas is the environment that the Bahamas has found itself in. And we're at the eve of the Bahamas looking at introducing a domestic minimum top-up tax. And that is, to a great extent, a result of the environment and the context. So the context around that is BEPS. And hopefully everybody in this room is familiar with the term BEPS. It stands for base erosion and profit shifting. And it is a global initiative that was led by the OECD. It began in the wake of the Great Recession. And the idea is to make sure that large multinational enterprises pay their fair share of tax. And that's the term large multinational enterprises has come to be defined as those that have revenue of over 750 million euros in their consolidated financial statements. So it doesn't impact everyone. But the OECD, at the beginning of this, set out 15 what they called action steps. And they were different areas that they were supposed to address the challenges. Action step 1, which was supposed to be addressing the challenges of the digital economy, they couldn't really come up with an answer on. So they decided to look at it from a different angle. They said that, the digital economy has become so pervasive that it's now the economy. So why don't we look at it from a different angle, and that being addressing the tax challenges of the digitalization of the economy. And they said, okay, let's look at it a second time, which is why we call it BEPS 2.0. And BEPS 2.0 is a two-pillar solution. And the Bahamas is currently finding itself in the world of Pillar 2, which is a global minimum tax. And the OECD issued some rules around this. And these rules are an interconnected set of rules which allow jurisdictions to tax MNEs, or large MNEs, on their economic activity where the effective tax rate, and that's very important when we're looking at this, is less than 15%. So essentially, we're in an environment now where large multinational enterprises are likely to be taxed at 15% on all of their revenues. The question then becomes, which government is going to collect that tax revenue? The key that we find, again, it's all environmental that we're dealing with for the Bahamas right now, but the way that these rules are written is such that in order to participate, a jurisdiction needs to implement them domestically. So the Bahamas is in an environment where it sees multinational enterprises operating in the Bahamas are going to be paying tax at 15%, likely no matter what. It's got a choice. It can say, okay, we're not going to do anything, and we're going to let a different government collect tax revenue on economic activity in our jurisdiction. Second, the Bahamas could introduce a domestic answer, a little bit like Bermuda did, a domestic corporate income tax. But for a country which doesn't have an existing corporate income tax infrastructure, that's quite a challenge. So the third option, as I see it, is the Bahamas could implement one of the structures that are included in this Pillar 2 solution that the OECD brought forward. One of those is the domestic minimum top-up tax. And one of the advantages of it is that the rules are already there written. What the Bahamas needs to do is to figure out how to implement them, which is a challenge in itself. So I feel like I've gone around the houses a bit, but I think one of the decision-making around decision factors around making tax policy is what is your environment and where you find yourself right now.
And just before coming back to that, how do you see compliance? So I mentioned that, Patricia, in terms of tax structure, because it's all fine and good to say that I want to implement a tax, but if I don't have the ability to enforce it, one of our former ministers of finance or state ministers for finance once raised the question, is it better to have legislation that I don't enforce or have no legislation? And he was being cheeky in terms of saying neither one is an ideal solution. But what he was saying is be very careful just writing laws. To what Olivia is saying, we're in a global environment that says you must do something. But how important is it for us to have the systems, processes, and compliance to ensure that whatever it is we choose, we can enforce?
Yeah, I think Gowon, that's very, very critical because there are a number of provisions that it doesn't really make sense to have provisions within legislation that you can't enforce. And I think the more that we move towards this space of we deal with multinational enterprises, that the compliance is, you know, it's more difficult. I think the tax authority within the Bahamas is still relatively new. And so, you know, some of the systems, I mean, there have been a number of amendments in recent years that have sought to somewhat strengthen the compliance regime and enforcement regime, and I think have helped somewhat in terms of developing that framework. But I think because income tax is something which is new, and there are a lot more. There's a greater level of complexity involved, because to some extent the business license is a relatively simple tax. You know, once we get into the income tax, and we're talking now about well, what financial standards will be used in terms of whether we're looking at the financial statements of the parent entity, which is not within the jurisdiction. And it's just a lot more, I think, a lot more complex in terms of the nature of the arrangements. We, you know, now have to look at putting in place a transfer pricing regime, because the Bahamas doesn't have a general, at this point in time, income tax system or a corporate income tax system. And so there are a number of factors that would need to be added to the bill, as well, I would say the structure of the draft legislation, I think, that have to be put in place. There are I mean, of course, as the bill as it's currently drafted relies heavily on the changes that take place and the clarifications within the GLOBE rules as they are as they're effected. And although it does allow for some delay in terms of implementation if those changes occur within the middle of the year, but but then there still, I think, will be a greater need for more guidance. And of course, a system in place within the tax authority to be able to respond effectively to this change. But I think I ultimately agree that yes, that compliance is a significant aspect of the new legislation and what's required.
I think it's really. Oh, sorry. Yep. I think it's really important to talk about compliance. And in traditional taxing jurisdictions, they'll call it verification and enforcement. The rules as they're drafted, as I said, are aimed at large multinational enterprises. These are enterprises that are complex. They have sophisticated professionals working in-house. They will deal with all kinds of advisors. So, as a verification and enforcement agency, the Bahamas government is going to need to make sure that they keep up with that level of sophistication as well. It's going to be very important and a big challenge too.
And just looking conscious of time and how we move, Tomás, the government has obviously signaled fairly strongly that there's a move towards corporate income tax. It's starting with the minimum top-up that has been there. We have the politics. So I will be the one to take the hit on this one, meaning we have the politics that say, I have no plans to do these things. But then we see all other types of activities, getting audited financial statements, better information and data to allow greater insight to revenues and expenses to come to it, et cetera. And you have certain of the government officials that, are saying, moving towards at least a corporate income tax and possibly replacing business license. Is corporate income tax, looking at a country like the Bahamas, and Olivia started in terms of saying, understand, the makeup of your island, where we are, what is going on around us globally. Is corporate income tax going to be possible and feasible without its sister personal and wider income tax?
I mean, there are examples around the world where that's happened, right? Where you have countries which are predominantly personal income tax-based, other countries which are predominantly corporate income tax-based. So I don't think one needs to live with the other. It's helpful if they do live together. And the reason why is you don't have to have as many anti-avoidance and anti-abuse provisions and expense restriction limitations, et cetera, right? And so it is helpful. But it comes down to what do we want our tax system to be? And this is the point we were discussing earlier, right? Around do we want a more regressive tax system or a more progressive one? An income tax tends to be more progressive and it tends to benefit the more vulnerable, but it's how we do it, right? Because if we're going to introduce a personal income tax, but we're going to keep all of our excise and consumption-based taxes, et cetera, then you're not really improving the system. So it's how you strike the balance between potentially introducing one, and I'm not saying by no means that that's the right thing to do, but if you did do it, how do you strike the balance between introducing a personal income tax and at the same time ensuring that you're protecting the vulnerable, but also attracting the super rich? So it's finding a balance, and it's nothing new, right? So it's been tried and tested in a number of jurisdictions, including only nominal tax jurisdictions. You know, if you look at the Crown dependencies, they're predominantly a personal income tax-based system, but they also have a corporate income tax system, which is sort of a standard zero rate. If you look at the Middle East, it's sort of the other way around. And so it's tried and tested. But the key thing is whatever policy decision we decide to do, if that is the introduction of a corporate income tax system to replace business license for the non-Pillar 2 groups, for example, we can't do it in a big bang approach, right? It needs to be incremental. You test it with certain whether sectors or services or whether that's sort of based on thresholds. So a number of policy decisions need to go into that. So I don't think it's a big bang approach. It should really be incremental.
And if we look at it in persons, if you have questions, I would ask you start moving forward. All of what we've spoken about up to this point in time spoke about a lot of information, analysis, and decision. So a key part of getting to the right answer is usually collaboration. You have persons with different expertise, different backgrounds, input. You have a private sector that knows their business and who they're servicing. You have a public sector that knows what it would like to extract from the private sector, but it also has its initiatives, like Patricia mentioned, in terms of its social strategies, etc. And then you have tax arbitrage considerations, that how much do I say and how quickly. So when we think about collaboration in devising a tax strategy, and we're speaking very much for the Bahamas context, what does that look like as it relates to bringing together the best and brightest minds under some non-disclosure of cost, but being able to bring the right levels of input so that we're not having, I forget who said it earlier, lack of buy-in, because it was said that whatever the tax structure is, there needs to be some level of consensus that says, yes, I take it with a grain of salt and I have a bit of spoonful of sugar with the medicine, but I have some acceptance. What does collaboration look like in your mind?
I mean, it's a good question, right? But if you look at sort of tax policy with a small p, i.e. tax administration, and you look at the functions of a tax authority, one of the core functions is always taxpayer services, right? And that includes things like, does the revenue authority have an appropriate taxpayer charter, for example? And that is, do we have a service level agreement between the private sector and the public sector? And there's a clear understanding of roles, responsibilities, how you both contribute to the policy debate, et cetera. And so a big part of collaboration is implementing the appropriate administration so that you can bring in the buy-in from the private sector. But vice versa, it's also very important for the private sector to understand and speak to the public sector in terms of, well, what's the overall sort of fiscal strategy of the country and how can we help you craft those. We have a number of discussions in the private sector around, well, we feel that this part of the legislation is wishy-washy. Well, how can we work with government to try and make it clear and achieve those policy objectives? And so a big part of cooperation is ensuring that you have bodies like the AIBT and the BFSB bridging those gaps. But the administration side of it is critical as well.
Patricia, since we brought you over to the bright side, or you've come and see the light, I'll ask you the same thing. What does collaboration look like? I will jokingly say, when I had my experience with it, it was making sure I didn't walk in any dark alley at night because the government may knock me down because of the confrontation that appeared in the public domain. But in reality, there was a lot of conversation taking place in the private halls, and those were far more constructive. But we, in a small island state in particular, we run into this issue of loose lips sinking ships. And both on the government side and on the private sector side, in terms of some of this being debated in the public domain. So how do you see collaboration where it is meaningful, and often it goes to the public domain because one side feels the other is not listening. So how do we get the meaningful dialogue where we can do more of it in discretion?
Yeah, I think the dialogue is of course necessary, especially since we're delving into areas that well, certainly we've not dealt with before as a nation, and so that input is required. I mean, when the government requests a consultation process, it's it's to solicit from the private sector, as in terms of both the taxpayers and advisors, to get a better understanding of what are the tools, what are the provisions. So I hear Tomás talking about provisions that sometimes are wishy-washy. That collaboration is necessary because, especially even in terms of where we had started earlier, in terms of positioning the Bahamas with a clear strategy, in terms of what is the competitive advantage. So, I mean, we know about the financial services and the particular emphasis on trust. How do we make the system more robust? Both from, and when I say robust, I don't mean in terms of just robust from the government side, but just in this a system that captures what is required to achieve the objectives and to get that buy-in from both the private and the public sector. Because in the same way that, like the AG said earlier, the government doesn't want to tax persons to the extent, I mean, a lot of industries are mobile, right? To tax persons to the extent that they leave the jurisdiction, because then that's not beneficial to either the private or the public sector. And so I think that dialogue is important, and I think just like what the AG was saying earlier as well, that there has to be, I think, a greater level of interest in taxation on a national level. I mean, persons coming into with both the legal profession and the accounting profession and just tax advisors, that level of interest and research and knowledge has to be built so as to facilitate the type of discussions that would result in the system that we all want to see. And yes, in the context of a small country, there is the issue of loose lips. I remember even when the VAT rate was being increased a couple years ago, and even being a part of the process, I think the information in relation to the rate was something that was kept very close to the persons involved. That wasn't, because these things have implications. So there has to be, I guess, a balance between that required collaboration and, but at the same time, some things, I suppose, can't be disclosed because of the implications, but that collaboration is very critical because, like Tomás mentioned, and Olivia, in terms of their background, you need persons on the domestic side who understand what the government objectives are. You need persons in entities that have on a more global scale. You need taxpayers who are multinational taxpayers who understand the needs and the issues, and even in this current consultation process with the DMTT, a lot of things will end up coming out which will improve the legislation because, and ultimately achieve something which is
Well, I hear coming from you
important.
trust in terms of the collaboration.
But I think there's a really, really important balance to be found. In the draft legislation, the government states that its intention is to introduce a domestic minimum top-up tax that meets the requirements of the qualified domestic minimum top-up tax. And so that leaves, it's very important that objective is achieved, because without wanting to get too complex into the rules, a qualified domestic minimum top-up tax will count towards that effective rate of 15%. If what's ultimately enacted is too varied or too divergent from that, there is a chance that it might not meet that qualified domestic minimum top-up tax rate, which would be a really bad thing, I think, for the Bahamas. So it would be it's so important to have collaboration, it's so important to have taxpayers and public consultation, but I think making sure that strategy-wise, as Tomás was saying, is we know what the goal is. The goal is to have a qualified domestic minimum top-up tax, and just finding that balance, which is a really hard balance to find.
I'll give you the last word, because either everyone had a very full lunch, no one walked to the microphones, but Olivia, not to be too mischievous, and I'll say that this is certainly not your firm's view or anyone on the panel, but if I ask this, in the global economy today, is there really anything as sovereignty in tax legislation?
That is a really difficult question, Gowon. I think we do, to your point, we exist in a global economy, in a globalized world, where something that somebody on the other side of the world does impacts me. And I think that recognizing that that's the environment that we're operating in is very important. And with that does come limitations. And with that does come questions around sovereignty. But the Bahamas, it's making the choice about what it's going to do with the environment that it finds itself in. And making a choice to do something, I think, is a great move. And just making sure that it implements that in a manner that's suitable is important. So, maybe?
And I think just rounding it out for all of us, I want to thank Patricia, Olivia, and Tomás. Tax is not an easy conversation. It's not one that's going to be solved in 45 minutes. We say in the Bahamas, when it rains on a wedding or a funeral, there's blessings. So I take the fact that the rain came down when we started talking about taxation, meaning that there's blessings on us as a country as we move into this. And so I'll leave it by saying sovereignty doesn't mean a lack of interdependence. Sovereignty means having the sense to know that when you make decisions in the best interest of your country, it may have to take into consideration those things that are happening outside. So with that, I want to ask you to welcome or join me in thanking our panelists. I think we had a good discussion and a lot more to come later on.